Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome also from my behalf in this beautiful, if slightly artistic hall of the Kaufleuten compound. I was very happy that Federal Council Burkhalter reminded us of the important position of Switzerland, of its capabilities, but also its responsibilities as a global player, or maybe more cautiously, global mini-player. And I quote him, he said, "Switzerland is, or at least should be, the actor of the future." The message was clear. When I started to prepare for this panel, I knew, of course, as everybody else here, that the world we live in is moving fast these days, very fast indeed. But hardly anybody could have foreseen the horrible events which have taken place just 3 days ago in the capital of France. Therefore, we must speak, if even shortly, because we had a very interesting panel before about terrorism, we must speak shortly also about terrorism's newest so-called achievements in this round, which I'm honored to welcome and receive at our podium. The general topic, the economics of war and peace, fits now, alas, even better, and even Tolstoy would have agreed. I'm sure that our distinguished guests of this panel discussion will give us important observations and remarks to the subject. Our general topic for the next hour, however, is Russia and the West, an economic perspective, to which we certainly might add the political perspective. But let me introduce my participants first. Vaira Vike-Freiberga is president of the Club de Madrid and even more well known as president of Latvia between 1999 and 2007. She was a driving force in achieving membership in the EU and the NATO for her country, and chaired or vice-chaired high-level groups on freedom and pluralism. She is also board member or patron of 30 international organizations, to mention only the European Council on Foreign Relations or a group on European security and defense. Last but not least, Mrs. Vike-Freiberga pursued a professional career at the Department of Psychology of the Université de Montréal from 1965 to 1998. Welcome here in Zurich, Mrs. President. That's already good, but we could do better. My other guest is Professor Sergey Karaganov. He is Dean of the School of International Economics and Foreign Affairs of the National Research University Higher School of Economics. He is or was also an important member of many councils, like the Russian Security Council or the Council for the Development of Civil Society and Human Rights under the President of Russia. In December 2014, Professor Karaganov was appointed to high-level panel of eminent persons on European security as a common project under the OSCE. He has impressively widely published more than 28 books and around 500 articles on economy, politics and security. Welcome here in Zurich too, Professor Karaganov. there is obviously no doubt about the highest level competence of our panel speakers. The schedule goes like this. First, we will discuss our topic in this group of 3 for about 30-35 minutes. Then you, ladies and gentlemen, have the opportunity to discuss the subjects with us and ask whatever you would like and address your questions either to President Vike-Freiberga or Professor Karaganov. I highly recommend to seize this opportunity to get first-hand opinions from 2 eminent personalities. And now let's start with the overture. My first question refers to the terrible attacks in Paris. How did you perceive them? What is the immediate impact and what could be a possible impact for the future? Mrs. President.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I think first of all it behooves us to reiterate our sympathy with the victims, their families, friends, and the people of France. Whenever these random acts of violence happen, our solidarity is awakened and our human sympathy as well. And I think that the situation reminds us that in order to have a world that we could call civilized and which we could live in peace and security, there have to be certain principles that are obeyed, if not by everybody in toto, at least with by a majority of the world's inhabitants. And I would say the very first one and the most important one, and which was broken visibly in Paris, is respect for human life. The suicide bomber is a typical example of somebody who not only does not respect other human beings, but does not respect themselves. And I think this lack of self-respect is symptomatic very frequently of those who do not count the life of others for any worth. I think it is very important for us to inculcate in children this respect for human life, because it is the very foundation on which civilization is built. But it's not the only one. The second one is a respect for the dignity of human beings. And that too we saw trampled underfoot in Paris, because attacks at random on people render them as objects, as anonymous victims. They rob them of their identity and the meaning of their lives because they've been attacked for no reason whatsoever. And I think this is the hardest thing to accept for their relatives and their families, that there was no reason for them to die, and that robs them of their dignity. So I think that our expressions of sympathy and of solidarity with them are an important way of reasserting that we respect the dignity of the victims and we do not respect the dignity of the perpetrators, who, even though they pretend to be soldiers in some sort of imagined cause, are actually nothing but cowardly murderers and have nothing to do with the sort of attitude one would expect from soldiers who actually go and do their duty in an orderly and acceptable way, much as war in its very nature, of course, is so much worse than the peace that we all aspire to. And lastly, I think the Paris events also remind us that you had individuals there who absolutely no respect for the rules of civilized society, for the rules and the laws of the land in which they live or which they visit. And that applies to individuals and to both criminals and organized groups, but it applies to countries as well. We do have things like international law, we have international treaties, and in order to live in a civilized and peaceful world, all countries must be expected to respect them. And I think this is one of the questions that will lead us to our topic, which is also as much of the order of the day, the behavior of Russia towards Ukraine and how Europe should react to it.
we'll come to that very soon. Thank you very much for your very bold statement. Professor Karaganov.
Well, basically, I agree with Professor Vike-Freiberga, but with a couple of additions. First, the terrible event in Paris was very predictable. Unfortunately, we are witnessing a disintegration of a huge area of the world to which we have contributed, one way or another. And it calls, and we are meeting this new challenge, or not, it's an old new challenge, in Europe, or what is a European space, losing 25 years almost completely, because we have had an opportunity to build Europe whole and free. And instead of that, we have a new divide. We have rough geopolitical rivalry. And we even now are trying, and I fully support Foreign Minister Bugalker, just to build some kind of a new rapprochement, which would have been automatic, I mean, in normal times. I mean, it's very strange that, I mean, now, I mean, leaders or top diplomats of several important countries are sitting, and we are amazed that they're sitting and we're greeting them. I mean, they should have been there from the beginning. We should work towards a recreation of some kind of a security space, acknowledging and understanding the mistakes which have been done. And I hope we shall work towards a recreation of some kind of a civilized order between states, of course, not only between people, which had been undermined grossly by terrible aggression against Yugoslavia, fantastically bad aggression against Iraq, and aggression against Libya. I mean, Russia, in a way, in a very mild and elegant way, but also very roughly, follows suit.
Thank you. So it's almost symmetrical, you know, we proceed with the applause, thank you. You said it was predictable. So you also would say the next one is coming. What could we do against it?
Now, we have to, first of all, I mean, we have to have a common strategy towards, the instability in the Middle East. And it should be, I mean, of course, a combination of maybe some help, but also a security strategy. At this juncture, we are dancing around. Russia has introduced its forces into the Middle Eastern quagmire, I mean, strategically, because it understood that it's better to fight there and to try to keep the instability under some control, which is rather than to wait until this instability flows to its territory and to the territory of its neighbors. I mean, before that, but we are still dancing, saying we're trying to compete with each other who gets better part of a deal. I mean, the deal should be there as soon as possible.
Could you imagine that such a terrorist attack could also happen in the streets of Moscow?
Of course. I mean, they have happened. They have happened, and we have had a huge, terrible attacks in the streets of Moscow, in the Moscow subway. We have had, an attack of terrorists on one of the concert halls. So we live with that. So we know about that, and most probably the Russian plane has been down. But we look at this situation. Let's put it this realistically. We have to fight it. We're increasing our security capabilities, but we have to do that together and it's not that we in a larger Europe, but probably we are in a larger world international community. At this juncture, we even not exchanging sometimes security information on terrorists, which is a terrible political and human failure.
Cooperation is definitely essential, we agree on that. And I think we would proceed now to the second topic. This is politics and foreign politics. How do you perceive the relationship between Russia and the West, Mrs. President, and why has this relationship turned into so many difficulties, rivalries, and aggressions?
I think we could use the example of a test developed by a famous Swiss psychologist, Jean Piaget. It was called Le Test des Deux Montagnes, and it consists of two paper mountain cutouts, which you place between two children, and the examiner asks the child, can you describe me what somebody sitting on the other side on the mountain, what they would be seeing? And the test is one of trying to see whether there's a capability of empathy, a capability of imagination and visualization, of putting oneself in the other person's place, which of course is a precondition for dialogue. And according to Piaget's work, this is something that does not come naturally to the human mind, but evolves genetically as the child grows older. And sometimes it may be not before the age of 10 that children really are able to take full cognizance of the existence of opposite views. In international affairs, one often has the impression that the climate between states is happening at the 10-year-old IQ level. We certainly have different views, and we do have difficulty imagining what the other side is, where they come from, and what their aims are. But there's even worse than that. If we actually imagine, or if we find out what the other side thinks and discover that it is radically different to our principles and to our values and what we stand for, and we did have that in the declarations of the terrorists, their values are different from ours. They're inimical to ours. And I fear that the values of the European Union and its members, such as they have been expressed and which the Union has been attempting to follow, and which the new member states have tried very hard to catch up to lost time under the Soviet system and the communist rule, to try and catch up to the 50 years of freedom and democracy that the West has had. These values are not being valued by our neighbors in Russia, and President Putin and Minister Lavrov, I remember at the Munich conference this spring, expressed quite clearly they have a different understanding, and it's a very similar somewhat to that of the terrorists, that the West is somehow decadent.
That's a strong point you make.
That it is, but you have to read these speeches, and they do say that Russia is the holder of moral values that the West has lost, and so forth. And then we do have, this is not just imaginary and a lack of empathy, we really do have two different ways of looking at the world.
Okay, Professor Karaganov, you don't have to be a specialist on Jean Piaget to comment on Mrs. President's statement.
Well, first of all, I mean, of course, their main problem was not a value-based one, but when it was a very simple, I mean, it's geopolitical-based one. 90% of Russian population at the beginning of the 90s wanted to, I mean, join Europe, be integrated with Europe. I mean, now a bit something, a similar figure, distrust with the West. That happened not because of state propaganda, but because of policies. I mean, Russia has been dealt with, as Russians believe, more or less in a way like Germany was dealt with after the First World War. I mean, there was a Versailles policy in soft gloves, in velvet gloves, and constant expansion, not listening to our interests and our concerns. There was no serious dialogue when we said, don't expand your alliances, especially NATO. I mean, nobody listened. Then we said, there is a red line, Ukraine. Never touch it. There will be war. Because Ukraine is something first special for Russia, but also it is a piece of territory and which Russia considers absolutely crucial for security. If it becomes a member of a foreign alliance, especially to friendly alliances, it is a casus belli. So in a way, Russia intercepted. And I think we have saved Europe from a big war by a small war. But of course, small war is also a disaster. And then, of course, the values. I partially would agree with Professor Vike-Freiberga that there is, a gap, and we didn't understand that gap until very recently because we didn't talk to each other seriously. Europe has been moving towards post-European values, while Russia, which had been cut from European values for about 70 years by communist regimes, was returning to European values, including, sovereignty, human dignity, human rights, and human freedom. Not exactly human freedom, personal freedom is very important for Russians, which we haven't had that for 70 years. Christianity, it was almost banned. A normal family. It was very hard to do that. In Russia, and at the same time, so we wanted to join Europe of imaginary Europe of Adenauer, De Gaulle, and Churchill, but we joined Europe, which is quite different. I don't think that West is decadent. I think that European Union has overreached. I think it has got itself in a very deep crisis. I think that Europe European Union will not be able to get out of this crisis without changing the institutional and political framework in which it works. But if it fails, it will be also a disaster for Russia because, in a way, even if we now have an opportunity to go Eurasian way, and there are openings in the East which we are using now, still, weakening of Europe and moral weakening of Europe is a very strong blow to Russian identity. For the last 300 to 400 years,
absolutely.
Europe was a kind of a magnet for most Russians.
Therefore, also the topic, as we have it here, Russia and the West is not totally understandable because you always had this kind of heritage from Western thought.
But I must reply to the casus belli question.
Absolutely.
Because since we are talking about war and peace, and may Lev Tolstoy rest in peace for writing this beautiful description of the feelings that both war and peace evoke in people, including the ability for some, under any circumstances, such as his hero Pierre, to experience moments of heightened consciousness under very difficult situations. It's a work of universal literature, which of course we respect. But to talk of casus belli in the case of an independent and sovereign country, wishing to establish a closer alliance with neighbors on one side of its frontier rather than the other, seems to me at the very least extreme. Because international law, international agreements, the Paris Conference, the principles of the United Nations, the agreements signed that the Russian Federation signed with the former Soviet republics at the dissolution of the Soviet Union, all are legal documents. The Memorandum of Understanding in Budapest, where when Ukraine gave up its nuclear arms arsenal, guarantees of its sovereignty and territorial integrity were given by Russia, by the United States, and by Great Britain, which have been singularly absent from the dialogue ever since the annexation of Crimea and the hidden invasion of Ukraine has been happening. And to actually legitimize the wish of the Ukrainians to actually sign not a full association agreement, but actually something that after months of negotiation just slightly tightened the economic ties between the European Union and Ukraine. After the summits where Ukraine was even refused a membership action plan for NATO, never mind being accepted as a candidate country for it, to say that this is a reason for casus belli, I think all of us here, from whatever country we come from, we should not sleep easy in our beds, because then any country whatsoever that takes a decision that Russia doesn't like, it may be considered as casus belli and reason for invasion.
Okay. You see, we really have a lively atmosphere here, so the Swiss are not always neutral.
I guess, so it's not a problem.
No, absolutely not, no. I mean, this is a very good sign of the discussion, and you mentioned NATO again, and I would like to ask you, why can the politics of NATO cause so much, I would say, distrust among Russia's leaders?
Well, first of all, we have inherited distrust towards outside world because the country has been built over a millennium of years of defending and ever-expanding territory. But we have been many to know, but it's a DNA of a nation. And as to the current situation, and its current situation is very simple. NATO was a 100% defensive alliance in the Cold War. And when, for better or for worse, it was, it was kept under a Soviet pistol. Both sides were keeping each other. So
of course. And how? Yes.
But then, when the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia was weak, all of a sudden NATO started to commit aggressions. Come on. Bombing for 78 days defenseless Yugoslavia and false pretext, then invading Iraq. And then doing whatever they're doing in Libya. I must say that I have changed my views of NATO now. It is, of course, not a very capable, but it's not a defensive alliance anymore.
But it was never guided. But this was never guided against Russia.
First of all, let's put it this way. It has been guided against Russia. We know that all too well. All the plans are more or less against Russia. When we were told that, for example, Americans are trying to deploy ABM systems, anti-ballistic missile systems. It might be that in the audience, thanks God, people are not knowing what is that. And they were directed against Iran, and we were saying that's absolutely impossible. Iranians does not have missiles. They were saying, no, but they could have. Now, Iran has disappeared. The ABM systems are there, and we knew that from the beginning, that they were directed at Russia. I'm sorry, but unfortunately we know, with whom we're dealing. And we'd better have these very nice people at bay.
Okay.
So I take it, dear colleague, that you consider that somebody, say the NATO alliance having done that you consider improper, gives you carte blanche to do anything that's improper as well. That seems to be the logical argument.
Well, I hope that we shall return to our senses, and we shall be building, some kind of a robust and fair and thus stable secure system of co-development, cooperation and security in Europe or Eurasia. We failed bitterly, and I believe that 75 to 80% of the fault lies with the West, not with Russia. But we also were faulty because we were weak. We wanted to be nice, and we thought that we could persuade. Unfortunately, we were not listened to.
Yeah, but
so we used the instrument which I think is now being listened to.
But now you were strong again, or at least you tried.
At least we want to be strong again.
Now, before we go into details,
no, I must respond to this business of being because when Mr. Karaganov is talking about the West being aggressive aggressive towards Russia. I remember telling Mr. Putin one day that he talked about the climate of tension between particularly the Baltic countries and Russia, and I said, well, we are doing our best to actually improve that climate, but it's very discouraging when we hear the deputies at the Duma repeating regularly, practically every week, like Zhirinovsky saying that the Baltics are a nuisance and should be nuked off the face of the earth.
Okay,
their leaders should have their heads soaked in the toilet bowls. And he said, who said that? I said, the deputy, the vice president of the Duma, and he says, whoever listens to a parliament.
Okay, anyway. Well, you know,
well, I mean,
it gets lively.
we are a much freer country than we used to. We are not yet, I mean, an exemplary democracy, but we couldn't hush up or hush down, I mean, every flamboyant deputy in our parliament.
Anyway, cooperation is important, and maybe if the two of you get together a little bit better in the future, there is also hope for Europe and for Russia. Only one short topic before we change to Syria and Ukraine. President Putin, who is an extremely successful politician, you cannot deny that. I think he has many skills, maybe also other sides, but he called the collapse of the Soviet Union the major geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. I think this quote is safe. Do you believe that too?
I must say that here I would disagree with my president, very simply.
How dare you?
Of course. I mean, and I disagree with the policies of my government on some other issues, but generally, by the way, I support the foreign policy of Russia. I think that a country which survived, which hardly survived the October Revolution, Civil War, and purges, and of course the Great Patriotic Second World War, losing all in all probably something like 50 or more million people, had a harsher geopolitical catastrophe than even the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I must say that after saying that once, Putin never repeated it.
Okay, that's an acceptable answer, no? So, speaking about Syria, where are we? What's Russia's engagement? What's the goal? What's the long-term perspective? Also the whole engagement now militarily by airstrikes, etc., etc.
Well, first of all, for me?
Yeah, please.
First of all, I think that for what I hope and I believe that Russia is strategic, both in Ukraine, where we are just simply teaching our neighbors, I mean, how to respect others' interests, and I hope we will find yes, and I hope they will find. Unfortunately, for Ukrainians, it is on their territory, but it could have been. We should have been saying that harder, maybe without use of force or even indirectly. And in Syria, I mean, it had been pre-planned, and it was obvious that that would happen. We are witnessing a disintegration of a huge area, and most of the states will disappear.
For years now.
And they're already disappearing, and there will be other states. So, and the question now is that how many territories and which territories will become the breeding ground for terrorism. I mean, we have had Al-Qaeda, we have Taliban before, now we have IS, Islamic State, we would have others. The question is how you manage that and where you fight the battle. There, or wait until they come to our territory, like they tried to come through Chechnya, which was which was largely funded by the same sources which are funding now the Syrian war. So that is long term, and medium term is probably a creation of some kind of a state there, maybe in some territories, maybe not in the whole territories. So it will be a relatively safe haven which could be defended, and then start a political process which would lead for a kind of a government which will be legitimate in the eyes of the international community and majority of the Syrians on that territory.
That will be the best case scenario.
That is the best case scenario, but whether we will rise a high risk strategy, the question is, I mean, if we would have stayed and waited, probably we knew what would have happened. I mean, that Israel would have spread, I mean, IS would have spread elsewhere, and they would have come to the Central Asia, to the Caucasus, and to other areas again and again and again, and to Europe.
So, what is the worst case scenario for Syria?
The worst case scenario is already happening, and that has been going on in the Middle East for a long time, in that sectarian, religious or pseudo-religious, tribal rivalries, centuries-old hatreds have been fomented and encouraged for one reason or another, frequently leading to proxy wars rather than actual direct confrontations between states or groupings of different convictions and identities. Here, I agree with my colleague Dr. Karaganov that the West has had its share of fault in what is happening in the Middle East, because at the beginning of the last century, when many of these nation states were created, they were created by putting within the same borders tribes and religious groupings which had been for centuries in a state of mutual hatred, and sort of stuffing them within the same nation state and expecting them to live happily ever after was really a tragic mistake. In the case of Syria, we have a situation where the current president and his small minority of Alawites whom he represents are about roughly 10% of the population, but they possess 90% of the wealth and certainly 99% of the power in that land. And then when certain parts of the population started rebelling and asking for more rights and more equality, very harsh measures were taken by Mr. Assad, and then the whole thing spiraled out of control. But we do have similar situations. The whole business of conflict between Sunnis and Shia, or in Yemen, between actually subgroups within each of these, then neighboring countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia infusing both their money, their arms and support in order to fight these proxy wars. All this is extremely unhelpful, and the populations of this region of the world in many ways are victims of their own age-old hatreds and their inability to have the dialogue. When Dr. Karaganov talked about the necessity of dialogue in Europe, of course we have it. I absolutely agree with Switzerland and everybody else that there was dialogue must be maintained. But in the Middle East, dialogue has been replaced by murder, mutilation, rape, and destruction.
Absolutely.
And it's very difficult to have dialogue under these conditions.
Absolutely. 1 second. One short question and perhaps one short answer. Did you welcome in the beginning the Arab Spring?
Yes, I was as naive and as romantic as anybody else who watched these manifestations on television on Tahrir Square. I saw a lot of young people going there. I have been for a number of years a member of the International Board of the Library of Alexandria. And during that time when in Alexandria, 2 buildings down, representative of the government, the building of the Interior Ministry was actually torched and burned down. Students from across the street from the Library of Alexandria made a human chain around this structure, which is largely made of glass, and not a stone was thrown at it, and there was a really hopeful spring-like atmosphere that the young people wanted more freedom, more hope for their future, more opportunities, less totalitarian oppression, and less arbitrariness in the way the state was being governed. Unfortunately, what followed was another form of repression, and Egypt so far has not, I think, achieved what these young people were hoping for. I'm very sorry to say.
The answer to this question is to answer also one of the reasons of the current loss of trust between Russia and the West. Of course, Mrs. Vike-Freiberga as a person and as a member of the board of the Library of Alexandria has the right, and I fully sympathize with what she says. However, the Russian analysts, and we know the area, knew that actually 90% of the Tahrir people were there, more than 80 actually, because the price of flour, bread, went 4 times. And we knew that what would happen, that immediately, or over any month, the ultra-nationalists or ultra-reactionary Islamists will come. And when we heard, I mean, the views of Mrs. Vike-Freiberga translated by or transferred by leaders of the West, we were looking at them and saying, are you crazy? Or are you simply incompetent? How could we possibly trust you if you are so incompetent? Everything which Russia said in Libya, in Egypt, in Syria has happened. I mean, one of the, we could make, I mean, rough gestures, but the Russian policy has been competent.
Mr. Putin reminded us of that when he was last time at United Nations, and still there was, or still is hope, that Obama and him, they might come together to find a possible solution for Syria and therefore also for the Middle East. Ladies and gentlemen, we had to skip Ukraine, but our Secretary of State already mentioned it at large. We had to skip the economy, and this gives you now, for the remaining 15 minutes, the possibility to ask questions about these topics, please. 15 minutes in all, so concentrate, make it short, and you get short answers, hopefully.
Yeah, one question to each one of you. To the lady, you have made your audience familiar with this experiment of Piaget. Was my ear right or wrong that there was implication contained that Russia has a lack of empathy, but that the so-called Western shows this empathy? And my question to Sergey is whether maybe this kind of rhetoric is an indication that the aggressor itself has a problem with empathy.
Maybe
brief answer.
Well, we are living, unfortunately, we are living in a world where, in addition to geopolitical rivalry, which has came back, and with economic tug of warfare, which we are living through, we are living in times of informational war. And I must say that I lived through the late decades of the Cold War. I've never seen anything like that. I mean, people are lying everywhere. Most of the information you are getting, and a lot of information we are getting, from official channels. Of course, now we have internet. But anyway, even the internet is incomprehensibly inaccurate, let's put it this way. And it's very hard. And by the way, it started, I mean, even before the Ukrainian crisis there. Well, the acute case of the start of the Ukrainian crisis. In 1913 already, the reporting on Russia in the West was 100% negative.
Okay.
You misunderstood what I was trying to say. Empathy means that you actually try then to find common ground in order to have a discussion. What really happened between the visions of the West and of Russia is projection, what psychologists call projection. In other words, Europe used to think that if only we're nicer to the Russians, they will be nicer to us, and they would project their own way of reacting to things and think that the Russians will act the same way. Russia, on the other hand, feeling aggressive towards the rest of the world and always feeling aggressed in a slightly paranoid way, was projecting its aggressive feelings to Europe. So both were projecting and getting it wrong.
Okay, next.
Well, I have my views about that, but I would not argue because we are wasting time.
We have dinner together and then we can solve the problem. So next question, please.
Maybe Professor Karaganov can answer my question. So, you know that the territories which are involved in the east of Ukraine, they self-proclaimed republics. And if in spring 2014 they didn't proclaim republics, but they thought joining Russia, would Russia be ready to annex them as Russia did with the Crimea?
Well, we really find, first of all, I mean, these republics revolt, people in these republics, and there was a wider revolt, revolted because there was a coup d'etat which was a coup d'etat.
A little bit louder.
Yes, there was a coup d'etat in Kiev, and there was no power, and there was a power grab of very unpleasant forces. As to whether Russia would have done so, I don't know. But we did, I believe that what we did in Crimea, which we call reunification, was because 90% of the people of Crimea, I mean, hated to be in Ukraine and they wanted to be back in Russia. And there was, I mean, referendum. Unfortunately, Western observers didn't come, but everybody knows that, I mean, there was a 90% vote. So,
next question, please. Yes.
Thank you. My question is addressed to Mr. Karaganov. For me, it seems as if you have evaded Ms. Vike-Freiberga's question about the reason for Russia's invasion in Ukraine, in saying that the NATO is no defensive organization anymore. And I was wondering, how do you see the future and the value of international law? How does it look like for you if violations of rules regulating the resort to war are excused or justified by these statements? Thank you.
We have had, I mean, we have an understanding that NATO would not expand at the end of the Cold War. I mean, unfortunately, Gorbachev was nice and stupid enough never to put this on paper because he trusted his interlocutors. And the Russian elite believed that, I mean, we are rejoining Europe, and we believe that we were also winners, and because we won over communism. After that, we had the continuous expansion of the Western spheres of control, including the military and political. The West was saying, oh, no, that's not spheres of control. I mean, we are imposing rules. I mean, we are putting bases. I mean, that's not a sphere of control. No, it's not. I mean, we don't have spheres of control. I mean, when others are looking at our European friends, and not only Russians, but others, they were saying, come on, how could they possibly lie into our eyes? I knew that most people were not lying. They believed that they were not expanding and their zone of influence and control, but de facto they did. And the crux of the matter came, of course, in 2007, when Russia again said no, under no circumstances could, I mean, the Western alliance and especially NATO could get to the territory of Ukraine. And then we learned that, in effect, I mean, a quick expansion, a quick enlargement was prepared. It was blocked by virtue of Russian diplomacy and also by Germans and the French. But then, I mean, a clause was put that Ukraine and Georgia would eventually become the NATO members. And then we saw a resumption of that, and a few important, not officials of NATO started to reiterate, I mean, their plans for NATO expansion. So it built it up, and then it collapsed.
I will draw your attention again to the term of sphere of influence. I don't believe that this is something that's part of the United Nations Charter, or that there's an international law that gives some country privileges over the fates of their neighbors as opposed to others. Whatever the qualifications for such privileges, Russia certainly feels entitled to having them, and those who happen to live in its neighborhood question that privilege. And of course, as far as the dangers of NATO are concerned, I can just imagine what a fantastic threat to Russia it must have been when the 2 million Latvians and 1.5 million Estonians joined NATO with their fantastic armies against this. You saw the map of Russia, how large it is, and the nuclear arsenal it has. We did it because we were invaded in 1940 and 1945, and we hoped never to be invaded again.
Okay.
Well, I was, by the way, President Vike-Freiberga must remember that about 10 years ago was the first Russian who said that it is if expansion comes, let it be a European Union and NATO. I must say that it was not a threat. I mean, the threat was NATO expansion. Of course, we're not, let's put this away, we're a big nation and the stronger, we're not afraid of Latvia. But we know that certain logic.
So why do you pretend?
Yeah, that certain logic. Well, there are, I mean, people in my country. I mean, we're a big country. We have all kinds of people. I mean, so who are afraid of Latvia. I mean, so excuse us. I mean, we are different. Yes, but we know. I mean, how logic works, and how this logic has been working and has been working. And we saw also that NATO again, and I have returned to my original comments, NATO, when undeterred, becomes aggressive. Or everybody, it seems, is, when undeterred, become aggressive.
Okay, it still all remains in the family, at least here up on the podium. Please.
I'd like to address Professor Vike-Freiberga. I have a question in mind, which is already for a long time in my mind, and I seize the opportunity. Russia and Latvia have a long common history. Latvia was for almost 200 years part of the Tsarist Empire, and it fared quite well. It fared much less well in the Soviet times, especially in Stalinist times, but that was true for everybody in Russia and in the Soviet Union at that time. And I can very well understand that Latvia wanted to be independent, but what I really don't understand is why Latvia and Estonia and maybe other countries of that region are not in a position to wage policy towards Russia which is less resentful, which is more constructive, given the fact that they have very good knowledge of Russia and of the Soviet Union, and they could have been some sort of intermediaries, that they could have been a connection between the West and Russia and have had a really constructive role. And I'm not convinced that Latvia has reasons to fear Russia at the moment. It seems to me quite safe in NATO and the European Union. So why resentment and no constructive role?
How do you interpret our resentment, for all? You see, as soon as I was elected, I accepted an invitation from Mr. Putin to meet with him. He was not ready to speak with the president of such a small country in the official and normal manner. We had to meet at a ski resort in secret in Austria, where he was skiing with his family and 117 bodyguards and buying planes from the Austrians. And at the time, I told him that was precisely what you said, that we stood ready to do that. Russia, by the way, introduced serfdom into Latvia when the last parts of Latvia were conquered in 1795. Before that, it had been under the Swedish kings, and if you like, the welfare of the population was much better in the preceding century than in the century of Enlightenment, which alas came with serfdom and the Tsarist domination. Before that, as a matter of fact, we had parts of our territory which belonged to Poland, but most of all, the country was conquered by the Crusaders in the 13th century, so that in terms of territory, if we belong to anybody, I suppose we belong to the Pope. Terra Mariana.
Yeah, but you know,
not to Russia.
if the Swiss would think about their past with their fights against the Austrians, it would also cause still some difficulties, but this is now for a longer time over. I would propose that you put one more question and then we really have to finish.
I would like to hear some short comments about the fact that during or before the German reunification, there have been given so many promises to President Gorbachev. What is about all these promises?
He should answer it, but would you like to do it?
Well, President Gorbachev answered in many ways in his books, in his articles, etc., etc. I was a participant of the political process at that time, and I was absolutely sure, and everybody was sure in Russia, that there were promises which would be kept. That's as soon as that. And of course, I was told by prominent, but not of course by the top politicians, because I'm a scholar. But I mean, no way, under no circumstances, there will be any kind of an expansion. I was a bit of hesitant, and that's why in 1991, I went to Yeltsin, with whom early 1992, and said, I mean, come on, let's fix it. I mean, it might be that it would, again, they would try to expand. Let us apply to NATO. And let us become a member of NATO. And he applied. And he said, no. They said, no, under no circumstances. I mean, but be aware that we are a friendly alliance and we are friends, etc., etc., etc. I mean, Yeltsin did not insist. There was a revolution. Again, it was a mistake. But that was the fact. Unfortunately, as I've said, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev was too nice a man to ask for, I mean...
he also lost power.
Yes, he also lost power. And then we had a revolution, by the way. When we had a revolution. And that revolution was, I mean, more or less, I mean, it was pro-Russian, of course, but it was, I mean, we are returning to Europe, so it was not a question in the mind of the Russian elites. That we would be a part of the joint family, there would be no threats, there would be no divides, etc., etc. As I've said, we were, I mean, romantic and maybe stupid. That was our mistake.
Well, Russians can be very romantic. It's the proof of a great literature. Somehow we escaped the Russian economy, and this is my definitely last questions, I'm sorry. Can you quickly summarize where we are with the Russian economy? Is there hope that it will improve? Is it a good country for investors also? Just make it as a short summary, please.
Russia has been in a structural crisis for a while, and this decline, which we're having now, is totally predictable. The Russian elite, mostly inherited from the 90s and from the year 2000s, as of yet not ready for a new round of economic reforms. So, I mean, at the same time, another part of the elite is very brilliantly waging foreign policy, which covers up for some of them, some of the problems. One problem. Second, the oil prices collapse, which brought in a very, I mean, which is of course bringing in losses, including losses of possibility of buying things abroad, but I think is midterm positive, because most of the Russians, especially the new middle class and of course the elite, have been earning unearned money. I mean, as a society, we were living off the rent, and that was unhealthy. Now we have a depreciation of the ruble. I mean, people are lamenting it. I say we should go further with that. I mean, and we should leave to our, according to our means, and start to work again. In the 90s, beginning of the 2000s, we worked harder than even the Swiss. I mean, believe me. And then we relax.
That's difficult to achieve.
No. What about, 14 hours working days? I mean, 6 or 7 days a week. I mean,
We do almost 20 hours a day.
oh, I know. Well, then we 22.
It's already a competition. That's a good
yes,
sign.
and the third element is, of course, sanctions, which are hurting and may hurt eventually, and which are, of course, spurring the Russian economic turn to the east, which has started before. So how we would end up, depending on how we deal with the problem. Eventually, I think that if we somehow calm situation in Europe and recreate some kind of a connectivity, economic connectivity of Minister Bugalker, there would be 40% European trade, down from 56 3 years ago. Now it's already 49. 40% Asian trade, 20% going down. That will be a healthy mix. I don't think we should go further. And of course, the monies will go back to Russia. Most of the monies are going back to Russia because the Putin is nationalizing the elite, and then of course people understand that it is unsafe to keep monies in the West anymore. So that is also healthy. So I'm very unhappy with the policies of economic policies of my government, but I'm not quite unhappy about these hard situations we are living through.
Okay.
I mean, strategically, but tactically, of course, it's very unpleasant. Even for a person like myself, I have to run organizations where the budgets are being cut. I mean, imagine.
Who not these days?
In this contest between who works harder, between the Russians and the Swiss, I fear that I, as a Latvian, my only hope would be to say we're like worker bees. We work without ceasing 24 hours a day, and then drop dead at the end of 6 weeks, but we don't.
Okay. Sorry, this is definitely a record. Thank you very much. Our Secretary of State predicted a lively, controversial, maybe even dangerous discussion. But at the end, I have to say, we got along very well. We started to like each other more and more, even to the point of dangerous developments. But maybe on this or another occasion we continue.
Sergey Alexandrovich and I know each other for a long time.
You didn't tell me that.
And she's my best loved opponent, I mean, in the world.
Okay. Well, then anyway, the setting was totally perfect. I only complained that nobody told me before. So, thank you again. I think it was a great discussion, and I hope that your countries will do progress as the world in itself, and that we hopefully come to better terms also fighting terrorism. Thank you very much.